The sky over Seattle was dark and churning, heavy with clouds that warned of an incoming storm. Lightning split the sky in jagged flashes, followed by the deep rumble of thunder that shook the ground. Rain pelted down on the windows of St. Anne Hospital with an unrelenting ferocity, intensifying the feeling of tension and isolation inside. It seemed as if the city itself was holding its breath. Roads were nearly deserted, and the hospital felt like an island in the storm. St. Anne Hospital was a sturdy old building with red brick walls and narrow hallways that held echoes of voices and footsteps. The night staff was especially busy, managing a steady stream of patients injured in road accidents, slips, and a few more severe emergencies. Seattle was no stranger to rain, but this storm was intense even by the city's standards. The storm's oppressive atmosphere weighed on everyone, adding to the anxiety in the air. Emma Johnson, a young nurse in her mid-20s, was working her first night shift at St. Anne. She had her brown hair tied back in a loose bun, and her bright eyes were both observant and a little overwhelmed. She moved quickly from room to room, attending to patients, responding to doctors' orders, and trying to keep herself focused. Beneath her calm exterior, however, she couldn't help but feel a pang of unease, especially on a night like this. "Just a storm, Emma. Just keep it together," she murmured to herself, trying to steady her nerves. As she organized supplies on a tray, the hospital's head of security, Mark Russell, walked down the hallway, making his rounds. Mark was a tall man in his 40s with a solid build and a reassuring presence that brought a sense of calm to the hospital staff. He noticed Emma's tense expression and offered her a quick smile as he passed by. "Rough first night, huh? Seattle's really giving us a show out there," he said with a nod toward the storm raging outside. Emma returned the smile, a bit nervously. "Yeah, I wasn't exactly expecting this," she admitted, glancing down as she rearranged the tray. "Well, if you need anything, just holler," Mark replied, giving her a nod before continuing down the hall. The sound of the rain seemed to grow louder, almost overpowering, and Emma felt a strange unease growing in the pit of her stomach. She knew Seattle's reputation for rainy nights, but this felt different, intense in a way she couldn't quite describe. Suddenly, a sharp scream pierced the quiet of the hospital, coming from the direction of the front entrance. Emma froze, her heart racing as a chill ran down her spine. Whatever it was, it didn't sound routine. Without a second thought, she dropped what she was doing and ran toward the sound. The hospital's lights flickered momentarily, possibly from the storm, adding to the eerie sense of something wrong. On her way to the entrance, she crossed paths with Mark, whose expression mirrored her own concern. "What was that?" he asked, brows furrowed. "I don't know, but it came from the main entrance," Emma replied, quickening her pace as they hurried together. When they reached the front entrance, they were met with an astonishing sight. Standing in the middle of the lobby was a chimpanzee, soaked from head to toe, breathing heavily. In its arms was a small baby wrapped in a blanket. Emma and Mark both halted, staring in disbelief, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. It was as if time itself had stopped. The chimpanzee looked directly at Emma, and in its gaze, she could sense something she couldn't quite explain. A silent, almost human-like plea for help. "Is this real?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Seems like it," Mark replied, equally stunned. "Let's get that baby some help." Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself for the unexpected night ahead. Emma took a cautious step forward, her eyes fixed on the chimpanzee holding the baby. She noticed the animal's chest rising and falling rapidly as it clung protectively to the small bundle in its arms. The storm raged on outside, and the dim, flickering lights in the lobby cast an eerie glow over the scene. It was surreal, a drenched chimpanzee, here, in the heart of Seattle, cradling a human infant. "Emma," Mark murmured, keeping his voice low, "we need to be careful. We don't know if this animal is dangerous." But Emma shook her head slowly. "Look at him, Mark. He's not here to hurt anyone. He's protecting the baby." Her voice was barely a whisper, a mix of amazement and empathy. With her instincts as a nurse kicking in, Emma took another step forward, hands slightly raised to show she meant no harm. She locked eyes with the chimpanzee, who seemed to hesitate but didn't move away. There was something deeply familiar in his gaze, almost as if he was assessing her, trying to decide if she was trustworthy. "Hey there," she murmured softly. "It's okay. You're safe here." To her relief, the chimpanzee, whom she would soon come to know as Charlie, didn't resist as she moved closer. Carefully, Emma extended her hands, inching them toward the baby. Charlie's eyes darted between her face and her hands, clearly nervous, but eventually, he let go of his hold on the baby, allowing Emma to lift the infant from his arms. The baby was small, barely a few months old, with wide, curious eyes that blinked up at Emma as she held him close. Just as Emma held the baby securely in her arms, the baby let out a small, contented sigh, nuzzling into her shoulder. It was as if the child understood that he was safe, that these strangers were here to protect him. Emma's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and protectiveness, while Mark, still standing nearby, radioed for a medical team to come immediately. The sound of hurried footsteps soon echoed in the lobby as a team of nurses and doctors arrived, rushing toward Emma and the baby. Mark signaled for them to approach calmly, gesturing toward Charlie, who was still watching them with wary eyes. "Is that a chimpanzee?" one of the nurses gasped, stopping mid-stride, clearly taken aback. "Long story," Mark replied quickly. "Right now, we need to focus on the baby. Emma's got him and the chimp. He seems cooperative." One of the doctors, Dr. Lacey Miller, approached Emma with a soft smile, carefully examining the baby in her arms. "He seems okay, a little shaken but unharmed. Let's get him into a room so we can check him over." Emma handed the baby to Dr. Miller, feeling a pang of reluctance as she did. She had only held the child for a moment, but in that brief time, a strange sense of responsibility had settled within her. She watched as the medical team carried the baby down the hallway, leaving her and Mark alone with the chimpanzee. Mark turned to Emma, his expression still one of bewilderment. "What do we do about him?" he asked, nodding toward Charlie, who had taken a seat on the floor, visibly exhausted. Emma crouched down to be at eye level with Charlie. She studied his face, noting the weariness in his eyes, the way his shoulders drooped, and the sense of purpose that seemed to radiate from him. She didn't know how, but she felt certain that Charlie had brought the baby here for a reason. Before she could say anything more, the silence was broken by the sound of sirens approaching the hospital. Mark glanced out the window and let out a sigh. "Great. Looks like the police heard about this little incident." Emma looked up at him, worry creasing her brow. "You think they'll take him away?" Mark gave a hesitant nod. "I don't know. It's not exactly every day that a chimpanzee shows up at a hospital with a baby in his arms. They'll want answers." Just then, the hospital doors swung open, and in walked Lieutenant Paul Harris of the Seattle Police Department. A seasoned officer with a calm, calculating demeanor, he took one look at Charlie and raised an eyebrow. "All right," he said, his tone serious. "Someone's got some explaining to do." Emma stood up, feeling the weight of the situation settling over her. She glanced at Mark, who gave her an encouraging nod before turning back to Lieutenant Harris. "It's a complicated situation," Emma began, struggling to find the right words. "This chimpanzee, he just showed up here, holding the baby like he was protecting him. We're still trying to piece together what happened." Lieutenant Harris studied Emma's face for a moment before looking down at Charlie. "And he hasn't shown any signs of aggression?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "No, none at all," Mark interjected. "In fact, he seems remarkably calm, considering everything." The lieutenant sighed, scratching his chin. "All right, I'm going to need statements from both of you, and we'll have to look into this further. See if we can figure out where he came from and what led him here." Emma looked back at Charlie, who seemed to be watching the whole exchange quietly, as if understanding the gravity of what was being said. She reached out a hand to him, and to her surprise, he took it, giving her a gentle squeeze. The simple gesture took her aback, filling her with an inexplicable sense of connection to this unusual visitor. For a moment, no one spoke. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor of the hospital lobby beside Charlie, the chimpanzee, her fingers still lightly resting in his. She could feel the warmth of his hand and the surprising strength in his grip. It was almost as if he was saying, "Thank you." She looked up to see Lieutenant Harris observing them with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Emma, you sure you're all right?" Mark asked, crossing his arms, his gaze flicking from Emma to Charlie. Emma nodded, glancing back at Charlie's tired eyes. "I'm fine. I don't think he's a threat. Look at him. He's exhausted and, I don't know, he seems almost relieved." She met Mark's gaze with a steady look, silently communicating her conviction. "This isn't an accident, Mark. I think he brought the baby here on purpose." Lieutenant Harris raised an eyebrow at that. "You're saying he understood that this was a hospital? That he would find help here?" Emma hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. I know it sounds strange, but when he looked at me, there was something in his eyes. Like he was asking for help, not just for the baby, but for himself too." The lieutenant let out a deep sigh and rubbed the back of his neck. "All right, well, strange or not, we're going to have to report this. A chimpanzee carrying a human baby into a hospital. This is going to raise a lot of questions." Emma felt a pang of worry. "And what happens to Charlie?" she asked, glancing down at him. She didn't know why, but the thought of him being taken away, possibly to some research lab or containment center, filled her with dread. Lieutenant Harris shrugged. "That depends on where he came from. But if he was with that baby, there's a good chance he's connected to the parents somehow. We'll have to investigate." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "What if he's from some kind of lab? There are places out in the countryside where they still use primates for testing, you know." Emma's heart sank at the thought. She glanced back at Charlie, who seemed to be listening intently, his head tilted slightly as if he understood every word. She could see intelligence in his eyes, something that went beyond basic animal instincts. "I don't think that's it," she murmured. "Look at him. He's more than just some lab animal." Lieutenant Harris's radio crackled, and he stepped back to respond. Emma and Mark exchanged a glance as they waited. After a few moments, the lieutenant returned, his expression grim. "They found something," he said. "A wrecked car about 10 miles from here, off a deserted road. It was hidden in a ditch, hard to see from the highway." Emma felt her stomach drop. "The parents?" she asked softly, already dreading the answer. Lieutenant Harris nodded. "They're still there, but it doesn't look good. We're sending a team to recover the bodies. And the weird part? There's evidence that they were carrying research equipment. Looks like they were biologists or something. This chimp, Charlie, you said? He may have been with them when the accident happened." Emma covered her mouth, stunned. She glanced back at Charlie, who was now gazing at her with a look of quiet sorrow, as if he, too, understood the gravity of the news. He slumped his shoulders slightly, his whole posture shifting in a way that conveyed a deep sadness. "It makes sense," Mark murmured. "If they were researchers working with primates, maybe Charlie was part of their work. He could have been close to the baby if the family spent time around him." Emma reached out and gently patted Charlie's shoulder. "You really cared about them, didn't you?" she whispered, feeling a tightness in her throat. She couldn't quite believe she was speaking to an animal, but somehow it felt right. Charlie looked at her, his eyes glistening, and she could swear there was a flicker of understanding there. Lieutenant Harris cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "Emma, you're good with him, that's clear. But we're going to need to arrange for him to be transferred to an animal control facility until we can sort all of this out." Emma's eyes widened in alarm. "But that's not fair. He's not a threat, Lieutenant. He brought a baby here in the middle of a storm. He saved that child's life. He deserves more than a cage." Lieutenant Harris's expression softened. "I get that, Emma. I really do. But we have to follow protocol here. He's still an animal, and we can't just leave him here in the hospital." Charlie, sensing the tension in Emma's voice, gave her hand a gentle squeeze, and she looked down, her heart breaking a little. She realized that no matter what happened, she couldn't just let Charlie be treated as a piece of evidence. "I'll go with him," Emma blurted out, surprising herself and everyone around her. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Emma, are you sure about that? This isn't exactly your responsibility." "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "But I feel like I owe him that much. He trusted me, brought that baby into my hands. The least I can do is stay with him until we figure out where he belongs. She glanced at Lieutenant Harris, her gaze unwavering. Please, just give me a chance to help him. The lieutenant hesitated, then let out a sigh. All right, but only until we have answers. Once we know his background, it's out of our hands. Emma nodded gratefully, relief flooding over her. She looked down at Charlie, who seemed to sense that something had been decided. Come on, Charlie, she murmured gently, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. Let's get you somewhere safe for now. As they prepared to move, Emma felt the weight of the night's events pressing down on her. She didn't know what was coming next, but she was determined to stand by Charlie's side, just as he had been there for the baby. Emma gently led Charlie through the hospital corridors, her heart pounding with a mix of uncertainty and determination. Every step felt surreal. She was guiding a chimpanzee through the sterile, dimly lit hallways of Sainton. Around them, a few staff members paused, whispering to one another as they watched the strange pair walk by, but no one tried to intervene. The intensity of Emma's expression made it clear. She was committed to seeing this through. Where are we going? Mark asked, catching up to her. Emma looked back at him, pausing just outside an empty observation room. For now, we can keep him here, at least until we know more about what happened with his family. This room is secure, and I can stay with him until we figure something else out. Mark raised an eyebrow but nodded. All right, I'll make sure no one disturbs you. But if there's any trouble, there won't be, Emma interrupted, her tone soft but resolute. She turned to Charlie and guided him inside, watching as he climbed carefully onto the examination table. He looked around, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was aware of the weight of the moment. She pulled a chair up next to him, sitting close enough to offer comfort without crowding him. Charlie, she said gently, unsure if he'd even recognize his temporary name. He looked at her, his eyes calm but tired. She felt a surge of empathy and couldn't help but reach out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. You've been through a lot, haven't you? For a long moment, Charlie didn't move. Then, slowly, he extended his hand toward her, his palm resting lightly against hers. The gesture was subtle, but it spoke volumes. Emma's heart ached. She was overwhelmed by the depth of emotion in his simple act. Emma, Mark's voice came from the doorway, breaking the silence. She turned to see him standing there with a clipboard, looking uncomfortable. Lieutenant Harris just got word from the team out on the highway. It's confirmed. The parents were researchers. They specialized in primate behavior and conservation. Emma sighed, trying to process it all. So that's why he's so attached to the baby. He must have spent a lot of time with them. She looked back at Charlie, who seemed to be listening intently, his gaze unwavering. They found a folder with the baby's birth certificate, Mark continued, lowering his voice. His name's Noah, and he's just 5 months old. He hesitated, glancing at Emma. The parents were part of a program at a primate sanctuary up in the mountains. Charlie here probably isn't just a project for them. He was likely part of their family. Emma felt a surge of sadness mixed with admiration. She couldn't imagine the bond these people must have shared with Charlie. They must have trusted him completely, she murmured. Enough to let him stay close to their child. Mark nodded, a somber look in his eyes. It seems that way. And when the accident happened, he did the only thing he could think of to protect Noah. Emma glanced at Charlie, whose gaze was fixed on her as if he understood every word. She reached out again, gently running her fingers over his arm. You did good, Charlie, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You saved him. Just then, there was a knock at the door, and Lieutenant Harris entered, his expression guarded. Emma, I know this is a difficult situation, but animal control is already on their way. We have protocols to follow. We can't just let him stay here. Emma's heart sank. She knew this was coming, but hearing it felt like a blow. She glanced at Charlie, who seemed to sense her distress, and she saw him tense up slightly. No, she said firmly, looking at Lieutenant Harris. Please, there has to be another way. He's been through so much already. He's here for a reason. We owe him more than to just treat him like evidence. The lieutenant crossed his arms, his gaze softening just slightly. Emma, it's not that simple. Animal control has jurisdiction over wild animals, and technically, he's under their responsibility. Emma held his gaze, desperation building in her chest. But he's not just any animal. He's family to that baby. He cared for him, protected him when no one else could. Doesn't that count for anything? The room fell silent. Even Mark looked conflicted, glancing between Emma and the lieutenant. After a long pause, Lieutenant Harris let out a sigh. "I can try to pull a few strings," he said slowly, "but I can't make any promises. I'll see if there's a way to have him transferred to a nearby sanctuary instead of a containment center. Somewhere that understands what he's been through." Emma's shoulders relaxed, gratitude filling her. "Thank you, Lieutenant. That's all I'm asking for. A chance for him to be somewhere safe." The lieutenant nodded, giving her a thoughtful look. "But you'll have to stay with him until they can arrange it. You seem to have a connection with him. Maybe you can help him adjust." Emma didn't hesitate. "I'll stay with him as long as I need to." As Lieutenant Harris left, Emma felt a renewed sense of purpose. She looked back at Charlie, who was still watching her with that intense, understanding gaze. "We're going to find a way to get you somewhere safe," she promised, reaching out to gently squeeze his hand. "I won't let them take you somewhere you don't belong." Charlie leaned into her touch, and Emma could feel the relief radiating from him. She knew there were still many hurdles to face, but for now, she was committed to standing by him, just as he had stood by Noah. In that quiet moment, as the storm continued to rage outside, Emma knew her life had been changed in ways she could never have anticipated. The following morning brought a stark contrast to the stormy night before. Sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, casting a soft glow on the walls as if trying to erase the tension of the previous night. The lobby was quieter now, with only a few staff members moving about, catching up on paperwork and recovering from the chaos the storm had left in its wake. But for Emma, the intensity of the night hadn't faded. She had stayed with Charlie throughout the night, talking to him softly, offering him water, and keeping him calm as they waited for news. Now, with morning light streaming in, her fatigue was catching up to her, yet she remained alert, determined to see Charlie through this ordeal. Her brief rest was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Mark, the hospital's head of security, appeared in the doorway with a serious expression. He was accompanied by a few higher-ups from the hospital administration, their faces stern and uncertain. Emma straightened, sensing that this conversation would be critical. "Emma," Mark began, his tone gentle but firm, "we need to talk about Charlie. The hospital administrators are concerned about having a chimpanzee here. This is highly unusual, and they're worried about safety and liability issues. The board has already expressed concern over the situation." Emma clenched her jaw, feeling frustration rise within her. "Mark, he's not a danger to anyone. He's done nothing but show us that he's calm and, honestly, intelligent. He's no threat." One of the administrators, a tall, thin man named Dr. Reynolds, cleared his throat, his gaze skeptical. "Miss Johnson, we understand your connection with this animal, but it's simply not feasible to keep him here indefinitely. This is a hospital, not a wildlife sanctuary." Emma felt her chest tighten. She looked back at Charlie, who was sitting quietly on the examination table, watching the interaction with a calm but curious expression. "Dr. Reynolds," she replied, her voice steady but filled with conviction, "Charlie saved that baby's life. He's not just some wild animal. He's part of a story that goes beyond what's convenient for us. We owe it to him to find a solution that respects what he's done." Mark stepped in, holding up a hand to calm both sides. "Listen," he said, glancing between Emma and Dr. Reynolds. "I understand both perspectives here, but maybe there's a compromise. Lieutenant Harris mentioned he might be able to arrange a transfer to a sanctuary that would be better suited for Charlie. A place where he'd be safe, but not confined in some cage. Until then, maybe we can allow Emma to stay with him. She's the only one he trusts right now." Dr. Reynolds seemed unconvinced, but he let out a sigh, relenting slightly. "Fine, but this is temporary, Emma. The moment animal control or the sanctuary is ready to take him, he has to go. No exceptions." Emma nodded, her gratitude tempered by a deep sense of responsibility. "Thank you. That's all I'm asking for. I just need time to make sure he ends up somewhere he belongs." As the administrators left, Mark stayed behind, giving Emma a look of support. "You've got guts, Emma. Most people would have backed down by now, but you're willing to stand up for him." Emma smiled wearily. "He deserves someone who will. He trusted us enough to come here with that baby. How could I just let him go without making sure he'll be okay?" Mark nodded, crossing his arms. "I get it. Just be careful. The more you get attached, the harder this is going to be when it's time to say goodbye." Emma looked down, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing over Charlie's hand. She knew Mark was right, but part of her wasn't ready to face that just yet. Charlie's hand moved slightly, his fingers curling around hers in a gentle grip, as if sensing her distress. She looked into his eyes, feeling a pang of something she couldn't quite name. A blend of admiration and sorrow, an unspoken bond between them. "Whatever happens, Charlie," she whispered. Leaning close, "we'll make sure you're somewhere safe. Somewhere you can be happy." Charlie blinked, his calm gaze never wavering from hers, and Emma wondered, not for the first time, just how much he understood. Just as Emma was beginning to feel a sliver of hope that Charlie's fate could be handled with care, the familiar sound of footsteps echoed through the hospital corridor. Lieutenant Paul Harris entered the room, his expression serious and focused. Behind him were 2 additional officers and an animal control officer, their uniforms a stark reminder that this situation had escalated far beyond the walls of St. and Hospital. "Emma," Lieutenant Harris greeted her with a nod, his gaze shifting quickly to Charlie. "I'm afraid we're at a bit of a crossroads here. Animal Control's mandate is to secure him. This is already raising a lot of questions, and the authorities want answers." Emma's heart sank. She had been hoping for more time. "Lieutenant, please. Charlie isn't dangerous. He's done nothing wrong. Can't we find another solution?" Lieutenant Harris sighed, clearly torn. "Emma, I believe you, and I don't think he's a threat either. But there are protocols in place, and with a chimpanzee roaming the city during a storm, carrying a human baby no less, this is beyond unusual. My hands are tied." The animal control officer, a stout, no-nonsense woman named Officer Davis, stepped forward. "Look, I understand this is emotional, but I'm here to do my job. I've dealt with wild animals before, and it's not as simple as letting them stay where they feel comfortable. They're unpredictable, especially in unfamiliar environments." Emma glanced back at Charlie, who had grown visibly tense. He seemed to sense the seriousness in the room, his posture stiffening as his gaze darted between Emma and the officers. Her grip tightened on his hand, and she could feel his slight tremor, a subtle but unmistakable sign of fear. "Please," Emma pleaded, directing her gaze to Officer Davis, "just let me go with him, at least until we know more about what happened to the family he came from. He's already lost so much. I can help keep him calm, I promise." The room fell silent as the officers exchanged uncertain glances. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel a swell of desperation rising within her. Finally, Lieutenant Harris spoke up. "What if we make a temporary compromise?" he proposed, looking at Officer Davis. "Emma goes with him, just until we have more answers. The baby's parents were his caretakers, after all. He's been through a traumatic experience, and Emma's presence seems to help him." Officer Davis considered this for a moment, her gaze flicking back to Charlie, who sat watching them all with an almost human-like wariness. After a tense pause, she sighed and nodded. "Fine, but it's temporary. Emma, you stay with him, keep him calm, and make sure he doesn't pose any risk to himself or others." Relief washed over Emma as she nodded. "Thank you. I'll do everything I can to make this work." Lieutenant Harris stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. "Emma, I know you're attached to him, but remember, this is temporary. Once we have answers, it's out of our hands." Emma nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She knew this was a temporary reprieve, but for now, it was enough. She looked back at Charlie, who was still holding her hand, his gaze steady and trusting. She couldn't shake the feeling that he understood far more than anyone could imagine. As the officers left the room to finalize arrangements, Emma leaned closer to Charlie, whispering, "We're going to figure this out, okay? I won't leave you alone in this." Charlie's response was subtle, but she felt him press his hand gently against hers, as if acknowledging her promise. With the immediate threat postponed, Emma felt a small flicker of hope. There was still so much left to uncover, but as long as she had Charlie by her side, she would keep fighting to honor the bond he had with the baby he had protected and the family he had lost. The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork, discussions, and hushed conversations between Emma, the hospital staff, and Lieutenant Harris. Emma stayed by Charlie's side, offering him calm reassurances and soft touches to keep him grounded. She could sense his unease as he watched the people moving in and out of the room, whispering and casting him wary glances. He seemed to understand that his fate was being decided, and Emma's presence was the only thing keeping him calm. As evening approached, Emma received surprising news. Arrangements had been made to temporarily house Charlie at a local animal rehabilitation center that specialized in primate care. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a far better alternative than the standard animal control facility. Lieutenant Harris had even managed to secure permission for Emma to accompany Charlie during the transition, allowing her to stay with him while he adjusted to the new environment. "All right, Charlie," Emma said softly, gently brushing her fingers over his arm. "We're going to get you somewhere safe. I'll be right by your side." As they prepared to leave, Charlie tugged on Emma's hand, an unexpected firmness in his grip. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite identify, a sense of urgency mixed with determination. He let out a soft, almost pleading sound, his gaze fixed on hers as if he was trying to communicate something important. "What is it, Charlie?" she asked, crouching down to look him in the eyes. She had seen him watch people, observe situations, but this felt different. It was as if he had something to show her. Without waiting for further prompting, Charlie released her hand and moved toward the door, looking back at her expectantly. Emma hesitated, glancing at Lieutenant Harris, who was standing nearby. He raised an eyebrow, clearly curious but cautious. I think he wants to show us something," she murmured, looking back at Harris. "Maybe he remembers something about the accident, about where the baby's parents were last." The lieutenant considered this, his expression shifting from skepticism to reluctant curiosity. "All right, but we stay cautious. Mark, you come with us," he said, nodding to the head of security. Mark gave a quick nod and joined them as they followed Charlie out of the hospital and into the damp evening air. Seattle's streets were quiet, bathed in the fading glow of sunset, and the aftermath of the storm left puddles glistening on the pavement. Charlie moved with surprising purpose, leading them down side streets and across intersections with an almost uncanny sense of direction. As they moved away from the busier parts of the city, Emma felt a knot of tension build in her stomach. She realized that Charlie was guiding them toward the outskirts, where the city's lights dimmed and the roads grew narrower. Finally, after what felt like an hour of winding through back roads and deserted intersections, they reached a secluded stretch of highway lined by thick trees. Charlie stopped abruptly, looking up at Emma with an almost triumphant expression. She knelt down beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Is this where it happened, Charlie? Is this where you lost them?" Charlie's gaze shifted toward a spot further down the road, and Emma noticed the faint glint of metal peeking through the trees. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned to Lieutenant Harris, who was already pulling out his flashlight and moving toward the site. The faint outline of a crashed vehicle came into view, half hidden by overgrown bushes and debris. Emma's breath caught as she approached, her eyes scanning the wreckage. She could see the remnants of the family's belongings scattered around: books, a small stuffed toy, and a few broken pieces of research equipment. As Lieutenant Harris and Mark surveyed the scene, Emma stayed with Charlie, her hand on his back as he looked at the wreckage. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense the sadness radiating from him. This was where it had all happened. The moment he had lost his human family and had been left to protect the baby alone. Mark knelt down beside one of the scattered belongings, picking up a notebook with frayed edges. "This must have belonged to one of the parents," he murmured, flipping through the pages. "There are notes here about primate behavior, family bonds. It looks like they were researching chimpanzee social structures. Charlie was probably more than just a subject. He was family." Emma's throat tightened, and she looked down at Charlie, feeling a surge of empathy. She could see now just how deeply connected he must have been to the family. They hadn't just been caretakers. They had been his companions, his protectors. Lieutenant Harris spoke up, his voice softer than usual. "Emma, we'll document everything here, but it's clear that Charlie wasn't just a passenger. He was part of their lives. This might give us the leverage we need to keep him out of animal control. If we can prove that he has emotional bonds, we might be able to secure a place for him at a sanctuary where he'll be treated with care." Emma felt a swell of relief mixed with sadness. This discovery might be the key to saving Charlie, but it also confirmed the tragedy he had endured. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders in a gentle embrace. He leaned into her touch, his eyes half closed, as if finally allowing himself to grieve. "You did everything you could, Charlie," she whispered. "You saved Noah. You did exactly what they would have wanted." The night air was still, a quiet peace settling over the scene as Emma held Charlie, offering him the comfort she knew he had been giving to Noah. For a brief moment, it felt as if the family he had lost was there with them, their presence lingering in the air, watching over him with silent gratitude. They would return to the hospital, and a path forward would be mapped out for Charlie's future. But for now, in this quiet moment, they were simply two souls bound by loss, resilience, and an unbreakable connection that transcended words. With the discovery of the wreckage, Emma and the team returned to the hospital, somber yet resolute. The finality of what they'd found left an indelible mark on everyone. As Emma and Charlie walked back into St., the air felt different. A shared silence of understanding and purpose settled over them. The baby, Noah, was in a room nearby, under observation, his future as uncertain as Charlie's. The days that followed were a whirlwind of inquiries and arrangements. Lieutenant Harris managed to keep animal control at bay, buying Emma and Charlie a precious window of time to solidify a plan for him. A few prominent wildlife and primate sanctuaries, intrigued by the unusual bond between Charlie and the baby, had expressed interest in taking him in, ensuring he wouldn't be confined in a standard facility. One afternoon, Emma sat with Dr. Collins, a primate behaviorist who had been called in to assess Charlie. He was an older man with a calm demeanor, his voice steady and compassionate. He had spent years researching primate intelligence and emotional depth, and his interest in Charlie's story was evident. "Emma," Dr. Collins began, leafing through his notes, "I've seen many cases of chimpanzees displaying complex emotions, but Charlie here, well, he's unique. The way he responded to that baby, the care he demonstrated, it's a level of empathy and responsibility we rarely see, even among highly social primates." Emma nodded, a smile of pride spreading across her face. "He's special, Dr. Collins. There's no doubt in my mind that he loved that family. It wasn't just instinct. It was something more." Dr. Collins adjusted his glasses, nodding thoughtfully. "I agree. This isn't just about survival or attachment. Charlie acted out of loyalty and protection. He saw that baby as his responsibility, and in many ways, he took on the role of a guardian. He must have spent a lot of time with the family." Emma glanced at Charlie, who was resting on a cushioned bench by the window, his gaze fixed outside, watching the rain as it drizzled softly against the glass. There was a quiet acceptance in his eyes, as if he understood the outcome of these discussions would decide his future. "Dr. Collins," Emma said, turning back to him, "is there any way to ensure that he can stay with Noah? I know it's an unusual request, but they need each other." Dr. Collins gave her a thoughtful look, then let out a sigh. "It's not impossible, but it would require a significant amount of paperwork and cooperation from several agencies. A permanent placement in a sanctuary that would allow visitation with Noah could be arranged, but a lot would depend on the legal guardian of the baby and the specific sanctuary's policies." Emma's heart clenched at the thought of the potential separation. She'd grown deeply attached to Charlie, and the idea of Noah growing up without his protector saddened her. But as much as she wanted them to stay together, she knew she couldn't control everything. All she could do was advocate for both of them with every ounce of conviction she had. Later that evening, Emma found herself in Noah's room, watching as the baby cooed softly, reaching up toward her with wide, curious eyes. She held his tiny hand, feeling the warmth and innocence that only a child could radiate. He didn't know it yet, but he was carrying a part of Charlie's family with him. Emma felt a tear slip down her cheek, moved by the resilience of this tiny life and the bond that had brought him here. As she sat with Noah, the door opened and Mark entered, his face softening as he looked at the two of them. "Emma," he said quietly, "Lieutenant Harris just called. They've managed to make arrangements with a sanctuary nearby that specializes in primates who have been socialized with humans. They're willing to let Charlie visit, and as a guardian, you'd be welcome to bring Noah to see him when he's old enough." Emma's heart leapt with relief. Really? They'll let them see each other? Mark nodded. They were moved by his story too. They believe that Charlie's bond with Noah is something worth preserving. Of course, it'll be up to Noah's guardian eventually, but the foundation is there. Emma looked down at Noah, then back at Mark, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you, Mark. Thank you for everything you've done to make this happen." Mark shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "I didn't do much. Charlie did most of the convincing just by being, well, himself." They spent a few more minutes watching Noah sleep, the room quiet except for his soft breaths. Finally, Emma rose and went back to Charlie, who was waiting patiently by the window. She knelt beside him, reaching out to take his hand. "They found a place for you, Charlie. A place where you'll be safe and treated with respect. And the best part? You'll still get to see Noah." Charlie looked at her, and she could see the relief in his eyes. He leaned forward, resting his head against her shoulder, a gesture so human it made her heart ache. She stroked his arm, feeling a mix of happiness and sadness settle within her. She knew this was the best possible outcome, but it didn't make the farewell any easier. Over the next few days, the hospital staff helped arrange Charlie's transfer to the sanctuary. Emma stayed by his side, accompanying him on the ride there, holding his hand as they walked through the sanctuary's gates. The staff there greeted him warmly, treating him not as a specimen, but as a being deserving of care and dignity. When it came time to leave, Emma knelt down one last time, looking into Charlie's eyes. "I'll bring Noah to see you, I promise. You're not alone, Charlie. You're part of a family that will always remember what you did." Charlie reached out, resting a hand on her cheek, his eyes full of a quiet understanding. She held his hand, savoring the moment, knowing it was a goodbye, but also a promise. As she walked away, leaving Charlie in the capable hands of the sanctuary staff, she felt a profound sense of peace. Their paths had crossed in the most unexpected of ways, and though they were parting, they would always be connected. In the years to come, Emma kept her promise. As Noah grew, she brought him to the sanctuary to visit Charlie, and each time they met, there was a joyful recognition between them. A bond that transcended words, a connection that time and distance could never erase. As the years passed, Noah grew from a curious baby into an energetic and spirited young boy. Every few months, Emma would drive him out to the sanctuary, a trip he eagerly anticipated each time. He'd chatter the entire way there, asking questions about Charlie, wanting to hear stories of the night his family's protector had carried him through the storm to safety. Emma told the story with warmth and reverence, each retelling reminding her of the deep bond they all shared. On one particular visit, when Noah was about 5 years old, he ran ahead as soon as they arrived at the sanctuary's gates, his laughter echoing through the trees. He knew exactly where to find Charlie, who was often waiting near the enclosure's edge, his watchful eyes scanning the path as if he, too, knew they were coming. As they approached, Charlie spotted them and let out a soft, excited hoot, a sound of recognition and joy. Noah, with his tiny hands pressed against the fence, beamed at him. "Hi, Charlie. It's me, Noah," he exclaimed, his voice full of excitement. Charlie moved closer, his face lighting up in what could only be described as a smile, a warmth that radiated from his eyes as he looked at the boy he had once cradled in his arms. He reached out through the fence, extending his hand toward Noah. Emma felt a familiar pang of emotion as she watched her son place his small hand against Charlie's, the two of them connecting through the simple touch that had once saved Noah's life. Emma stood back, letting them share the moment. She'd come to understand that this wasn't just a visit for Noah, it was a reunion between family. Each time they visited, Noah would share his world with Charlie, telling him stories about school, friends, and the adventures of his young life. Charlie would sit, watching and listening, his gaze filled with a quiet understanding that needed no words. One day, after they'd spent hours with Charlie, Emma and Noah sat beneath a tree near the enclosure, enjoying the warmth of the afternoon sun. Noah looked up at her, a question in his young, thoughtful eyes. "Mom," he began slowly, "why did Charlie save me?" Emma paused, considering how to explain such a deep, instinctive act. "Well, Noah," she replied, "Charlie loved your parents. They were his family, and when the accident happened, he did what they would have wanted. He protected you. He wanted to keep you safe." Noah seemed to take this in, nodding slowly. "So, he's like my other family then?" Emma smiled, her heart swelling with pride and affection. "Yes, honey. He'll always be part of our family." As Noah grew older, his bond with Charlie deepened. He often told his friends about his chimpanzee family member with pride, and he even began to volunteer at the sanctuary as a teenager, helping with the care of other animals and learning from the dedicated staff who had come to know and love Charlie. Over the years, the sanctuary shared updates on Charlie's life with Emma and Noah. His health remained strong, and his gentle, observant nature continued to charm the staff and visitors. In the sanctuary's records, Charlie's story became a legend, an example of loyalty, bravery, and the profound connection that could exist between species. One summer, just before Noah was set to leave for college, they made one last trip together to see Charlie. As they arrived, Charlie, now graying around his face but still alert and filled with that familiar warmth, moved closer, recognizing his old friend. Noah knelt by the enclosure, his voice softer and deeper now, his hand reaching out just as it had when he was a child. "Hey, Charlie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going off to college soon, but I'll come back to see you, I promise. You'll always be part of my life." Charlie looked into Noah's eyes, his gaze as deep and knowing as ever. He reached out to place his hand against Noah's. The two of them locked in a final, silent exchange that carried years of shared history and unspoken gratitude. Emma stood back, watching her son and the chimpanzee who had saved him. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that this was no ordinary goodbye. It was a celebration of a connection that had shaped them both, a bond that had carried them through tragedy and brought them into each other's lives. As they walked away that day, Emma felt a profound sense of gratitude for Charlie, for Noah, and for the beautiful, unexpected family they had formed. The sanctuary would always be a home for Charlie, and Emma knew that, in his heart, he would forever be part of theirs. Even as time passed, and their visits became less frequent, Noah and Emma carried the story of that stormy night and Charlie's heroic act in their hearts. For them, Charlie was more than just a chimpanzee. He was a symbol of love and resilience, a reminder that family can be found in the most unexpected places and that sometimes, the bonds we forge transcend all boundaries, lasting a lifetime and beyond. Years went by, and although the visits to the sanctuary became rare as life swept Noah into adulthood, the memory of Charlie remained vivid for both him and Emma. Every holiday, Noah would call his mother from wherever he was, sometimes across the country, sometimes halfway across the world, to reminisce about the moments they shared with Charlie. Emma cherished these calls, knowing that the bond they'd formed with Charlie would never truly fade. But one winter evening, after receiving a call from the sanctuary, Emma realized that time was finally catching up to Charlie. He had aged gracefully over the years, but now, at nearly 40, he was showing signs of slowing down. The sanctuary staff wanted Emma to know that Charlie's health had begun to decline. His appetite was weaker, his movements slower, and his days were spent mostly resting in the sun, his gaze distant yet peaceful. Emma took a deep breath, a mix of sadness and gratitude filling her. She knew it was time to see him one last time. She called Noah, who was in his final year of university, and shared the news. Without hesitation, he arranged to fly home, determined to be there for the chimpanzee who had changed the course of his life. Together, Emma and Noah made the familiar drive to the sanctuary, this time with a quiet sense of purpose. When they arrived, the sanctuary staff welcomed them with compassion, guiding them to the quiet area where Charlie rested in his favorite spot beneath a large oak tree. His enclosure had been made as comfortable as possible, with soft bedding and plenty of space to lounge. As they approached, Charlie lifted his head, his gaze lighting up with a familiar recognition. Noah knelt down beside him, reaching out to gently touch Charlie's hand through the fence. "Hey, Charlie," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here." Emma sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on Noah's shoulder. She watched as Charlie slowly extended his hand, touching Noah's gently, his gaze filled with that same deep understanding she remembered from years before. Despite his age and frailty, Charlie's eyes still held that spark of wisdom and kindness that had drawn her to him from the very beginning. For hours, they sat together, talking to him, sharing memories, and reliving moments that had shaped their lives. Charlie seemed to listen, his head resting against the enclosure as if he was savoring their voices, taking in the love and gratitude that filled the air. As the afternoon turned to evening, Emma felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She knew this was the farewell she'd feared, but had always known would come. She leaned in close, her hand resting gently on Charlie's, her voice soft and full of love. "Thank you, Charlie," she whispered, her words catching in her throat, "for everything you've done, for the love you've given us. You'll always be part of our family." Charlie's gaze met hers, and for a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. In that quiet space, Emma felt the weight of his life, his bravery, his loyalty, his gentle heart. She realized that while this might be goodbye, the impact he'd had on their lives would never fade. His legacy would live on through her, through Noah, and through the countless lives he'd touched along the way. When the time came to leave, Emma and Noah walked away slowly, their hearts heavy yet full of gratitude. They knew they'd been given a gift, a rare chance to witness a life lived with courage and love, to share a bond that had transcended species and circumstance. And though Charlie's days were nearing their end, his spirit would forever remain with them. In the years that followed, Emma and Noah carried Charlie's memory forward, sharing his story with friends and family, teaching others about the power of compassion and the bonds that can form in the most unexpected places. Charlie's legacy became a part of their family lore, a tale of love, resilience, and the enduring connection between beings who, despite all odds, found each other and became family. And as they told his story, they honored him, ensuring that his memory lived on, proof that sometimes the purest forms of love come from the most surprising places, and that family is not defined by blood, but by the courage to care for one another, even in the face of life's greatest challenges. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and watch this next story. It's truly heartwarming.